much. The next is the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce, Leeann Watson and Hamish Jensen-Fraser, and you're going to cover off obviously the draft annual plan, but also the proposal to increase rates on vacant central city land. Thank you.
Kia ora everyone, and thank you for the opportunity once again to submit on the draft annual plan. As the Mayor said, joining me today is one of my team members, Hamish Jensen-Fraser, who some of you may have met or come across, but Hamish has been instrumental in putting together our submission, so wanted to include Hamish today in the conversation. So as you know, the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce represents over 2,700 employers and over 70,000 employees. And our submission is based on both insights and issues raised by both our members, but also the wider business community. The Chamber advocates on policies that help shape and enable a business environment that is also conducive to economic growth. So I'll provide just a brief overview of some of the main points of our submission, and then obviously happy to respond to any questions that you may have. So to provide you with some context, our economy is in a perfect storm. The era of lockdowns and gathering restrictions may be over, but of course the consequences are now only starting to rear their head. Inflation is at a 32-year high, showing no signs of slowing down. And of course supply chains, as we've just heard from the previous presentation, continue to be disrupted, and the cost of doing business is increasing at a rapid rate. Our labour market is under significant strain. Next time you walk through the central city, just count how many signs are in staff windows asking for more staff. And of course, this is the single biggest issue that our business community faces right now. And it's not just in relation to the hospitality sector that we hear from often, but it's right across all sectors, including our manufacturers. So there is no slack in the labour market, and it has been exacerbated, of course, also by household contacts and isolation and some of the behaviours that we've seen change in our community in regards to the widespread transmission of COVID. So whilst we've got the reopening of the border and the resumption of tourism, which is extremely important and very positive in the aid of our economic recovery, it is not just, of course, people coming in that we need to take into account, it's also the people that will leave our city and our region. Really important that we do take that into account. The government estimates that around 50,000 people will leave New Zealand this year, and we know that in the Canterbury region alone, we need 10,000 per year to fill the labour market gap. So we are in an environment that is exceedingly damaging to business and certainly not conducive to business growth or success. 90% of our members expect that economic conditions will not improve for at least a year, irrespective of the borders opening and those easing of those restrictive measures. So that's a pretty sobering piece of information that we wanted to just bring to the table today. The Chamber does recognise that the Council has attempted to demonstrate a plan that does show restraint. And while we've moved out of lockdown, or the red setting, and we've got significant pressures continuing to affect both businesses and the residents of the city, it's vital that the Council understands both of those key areas. So due to the circumstances that I've just outlined and the cost of doing business at an unsustainable level, and with cost pressures increasing in every direction, the Chamber is unable to support the proposed rate increases. Businesses, and in particular small businesses, can only absorb so much. We do, however, recognise that the Council faces the same inflationary pressures as every other business, and that the proposed rate increase has been kept below the rate of inflation. However, the perception is that rates must always increase every year in order to keep delivering services. It would be remiss of me to propose an alternative figure at this point, nor are we proposing no increase at all. Austerity is not the answer. What we do propose is that the Council gives more consideration to reprioritising and asset recycling, which we're pleased to see has occurred on a small scale, and it considers those levers before automatically increasing the rates. Increasing rates is one option that the Council has to fund itself, but it is not the only option. And whilst it's been considered the easiest option, all of the other more difficult options, such as reprioritisation and exploring options for cutting costs and further recycling of assets, should also be considered in tandem. Our expectation, and of course the expectation of everyone in the city who contributes rates, is that there is sound rationale behind every expense and every decision that the Council makes, and that any activity the Council engages in positively contributes to both social and economic recovery. The The recovery and development of our regional economy needs to be at the forefront of the Council's agenda. As we reconnect with the world and return to some semblance of normality, it is crucially important that Christchurch and the Canterbury region are well positioned. Christchurch needs to be a prime location of choice for both domestic and international migrants to address our current market labour constraints. Christchurch must also be positioned as a city to attract and provide great experiences for domestic and international tourists that our city, in particular our central city, are so reliant on. Christchurch also needs to be viewed as a modern city to live, with the vibrancy and the infrastructure to make it a compelling choice for not only those new, but also our existing residents, but for businesses to also invest and to grow. Economic growth is fundamental to achieving strong community outcomes for everyone. As briefly touched on in our submission, the change to performance standards in relation to the production and delivery of events we feel is inadequate. Events are one of those crucial ingredients in our city's economic recovery, as witnessed recently by the Women's Cricket World Cup, which showcased our new Christchurch on an international stage, which, by the way, was an audience 7 times larger than the last Men's Rugby World Cup. Aside from the significant economic contribution, major events showcase the attractiveness and the potential of Christchurch and the Canterbury region, and they have a significant impact on also the social wellbeing of our residents across our city. The Council must do more to support our events sector and ensure it is appropriately funded to also compete with others on the stage in New Zealand. We've seen on so many occasions, and you've heard me over the last few years talk about what we have missed out on in terms of not having the right infrastructure. We've now got some of that infrastructure, so we must make sure that it is funded appropriately so that we can attract the right events to actually make use of that infrastructure. The Council's role and commitment to regional economic development and to engage with businesses in the process needs to also be a very strong focus. Unfortunately, there is still a perception by the business community that local government is a handbrake on growth and an installer of red tape. The Council should have a strong focus to change that perception and become known as a facilitator and an enabler for business development and growth in our city and our region. The level of communication and level of engagement with business needs to be at the forefront of the Council's agenda, and that begins with the Council demonstrating an understanding of the pressures that businesses face and also a willingness to help address them. It's pleasing to see that the Council is actively preparing for the future with significant investment in Three Waters infrastructure. Everyone who has smelt the stench wafting over the city in the recent weeks, I'm sure would agree. There are some local governments elsewhere in the country who favour vanity projects over the provision of core services, and we are pleased to see initiatives that focus squarely on this with a view of becoming a more sustainable city and anticipating their population growth. Climate change is also important, and important for us to point out that our preference is that the Council's focus on education and incentivisation, and also to bear in mind that it does not necessarily need to be the Council who solely provides the funds, the implements and the initiatives, and not be afraid to partner with others across our community who are working in that space. Lastly, I want to provide some more commentary on the vacant land differential, given the level of interest that we've seen across the city on this proposal. So one councillor has previously referred to this as a tax and that they're pretty excited by it. To be clear, we don't share that same level of excitement. Development of vacant land in our central city needs to be incentivised and encouraged, not penalised with a fine, which is what we believe this rate actually is. This misses the point that there are landholders who have good intentions but have been unable to progress development, whether that's due to the supply chain constraints, the poor economic conditions, contingency on anchor projects, waiting for road layout changes, or simply because they're waiting for the council to approve consents. A fine does not remove any of these barriers to development, nor will it speed up the development. Instead of issuing fines disguised as a rate, the council needs to focus instead on understanding why landowners are not developing the vacant sites in the first place. For example, in the press yesterday, it was reported that volatility in the construction market is complicating development in the East Frame, right on our own back doorstep. Developers are facing difficulties progressing not because of their own lack of interest or land banking, but because of external factors. What image does it send to potential developers when the response from the council is to issue a fine because they're not moving fast enough? It goes back to my earlier point about the business community's perception of the council and its lack of understanding on the current environment that businesses are facing. Our preference is for the differential to be scrapped altogether, or at the very least significantly narrowed in scope. Our recommendation is that if the council's intention is to solely target land bankers, then the vacant land fine needs to be applied solely to land bankers, and not also to those who have legitimate intentions. Narrow the scope instead of casting the net wide and hoping you catch a handful of people. Target the car parks, for example, that are full of weeds and potholes first. So in conclusion, the key point I want to reiterate through our submission today is that the council must take into account the business community and the very real challenges that they have faced not only over the last 2 years, but they continue to face when you are making your decisions. It might be easy to think that business is back to normal because we're not in lockdown, our borders are reopening, but it most certainly is not. Thank you very much, and very happy to answer any questions.
Can I just start with that last one? The vacant land, for the purposes of the rating proposal that we've gone out with, it's defined as land being with no active or consented use and excludes sites that are under development or in a temporary use that is a permitted activity under the district plan or has an approved and fully implemented resource consent. So I get where you're coming from, but are you saying that we just haven't gone quite far enough with that framework?
What I'm saying is that there are a number of reasons where some of that intention of that land may not necessarily be known by the council. So to do some more work on understanding what the hold-up is on those sites rather than assuming that they're automatically land banking if there has not been any progress made on them. Because of the current environment that we're operating in and the very real constraints that we are seeing across the construction sector, it's really important that we understand what those intentions are rather than just making some assumptions that people are automatically land banking.
Yeah, no, and the staff have been working with all of the vacant landowners in the last wee while. They've been working with the so-called, I'm not going to call them what they get the headline with, but the sort of undeveloped derelict sites that impinge on our footpaths as well. So the staff are working with people, but you're saying just go a little bit further and frame it in that way.
Yeah, and I guess taking into account the current environment and making sure that, if the council are committed to doing this, to at least provide some notice of intent, that this is what we're doing, this is why we want to do this, but to give some notice of intent, taking into account the current environment that not only we've been through in the last couple of years, but we're still in.
Yeah.
So
timing's everything.
Yeah.
Okay, Sam and Jake.
Oh, thank you. A really quick one. Thanks, Leeann, for coming in. Just in terms of you talked about the barriers or council being enabling as opposed to being a handbrake. I mean, it is a theme we get raised quite a lot. I just wonder, whether at some stage, and it might be something for Dawn to take offline, whether there's a reporting in function of the feedback you're getting from people as what those issues are, because I'd really like to see them and then see what progress we're making internally. It's kind of like if we don't know, we don't know.
Yes, absolutely.
So can we maybe take that offline and look at how we can do it?
Yeah, we'd love to do that. And we do that through some forums, but I think we can widen that. So we have a very active Central City Business Forum that I know Dawn's been to a couple of times, which is exactly the point of that forum, where those issues are raised around the table and the council, as are other agencies, actively involved in that discussion, and they go away and try and find solutions.
That's really good, because we've tasked Christchurch NZ with doing the same thing. So it would make perfect sense to feed into that.
Yeah, and Christchurch NZ are part of that same forum as well.
Perfect.
Jake?
Great, thanks for that. And just following on from Leeann's point around sites that are defined as having no consent or even understood use for getting to a consent and that have been working with our staff for 10 years, are you saying that they're all not land banking?
They haven't been working with the staff for 10 years. I'll just flick you in. It's only the last few years that it's been operating. It's not 10.
Oh, but 10 years of vacant sites is what I mean, regardless of how long. In terms of no consent, no understood use.
Yeah. Look, Jake, I don't know the answer to how many of those particular businesses will be land banking or not, but I don't think the council should make an assumption that they are all land bankers. And I think we need to take into account the current environment. And when we talk about the last 10 years, let's be realistic that, a lot of the anchor projects have only just been delivered in the last 2 or 3 years. And many of those sites around the central city in particular have been waiting on some of those major anchor projects to be completed. the infrastructure to be put around them. So I think we need to, be fair and to understand what the environment has been, not only in the last 10 years, but certainly in the last 2, and the environment right here, right now.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a fair comment. Aaron and Yanni.
Yeah, thank you for the
Sorry, I've got James up on behind
presentation.
me as well.
My question's around the supply chain that you raised, and a lot of people are talking about it because there's only so much cement, so much steel, so much wood, so much jib to go around. Has your group discussed at all whether councils and government should be cutting back on their projects or not, essentially? Just everyone keep firing ahead and keep staying in a bidding war for a limited supply of product.
Yeah. No, we haven't.
That drives the price up.
Yeah, we haven't discussed that. I mean, I think it would be a bit of a slippery slope to stop major infrastructure across the country to let private developers carry on. I think, we need to do both. We need to address the supply chain issues rather than actually, work at the bottom of the cliff. The supply chain issues are very, very complex, but they're very, very real. So there is no silver bullet. There's no easy fix on supply chain constraints. A lot of it is driven by offshore. And
there's no end in sight, which is more the problem.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying ditch projects altogether, but should councils and the government be putting the brakes on their stuff a little, or not, or do everyone just keep bidding and we'll see how we go?
Yeah, I don't think we should be putting the brakes on our infrastructure development across New Zealand at all.
Thank you.
Yanni, then James.
Thank you, and thank you for making the deputation. I just wanted to be really clear. In reference in your submission under 10 and in your verbal presentation, you talked about the waters being often neglected by local government in favour of vanity projects. You're not identifying any vanity projects that you think we're doing that you're saying you're worried about.
No, quite the opposite.
You're just saying you appreciate the investment that we're making.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the point,
Cool.
the point that we were making was that we applaud the council for focusing on the core service delivery and getting that right, versus focusing on vanity
and
projects.
Just the second question for clarification, I was just a bit keen to kind of understand. You kind of raise concern that we're not really focused on economic development, and there's little regard for the business community in the draft plan, and lack of recognition local businesses are fundamental to economic growth. I'm just trying to understand if that relates to our funding for Christchurch NZ, or what's the recognition of the role of Christchurch NZ versus the council, and do you think we need to make improvements to Christchurch NZ given what you've said in your submission?
Yeah, there's a couple of things in regards to, because there's probably about 3 questions all in one there. So the first one is, economic development is absolutely crucial to take our city forward, more so than ever. The funding of Christchurch NZ is absolutely vital. The reference to it being inadequate was around the event side of things. So that was the reference there. And in regards to, and particularly because, we talked a little bit about the infrastructure that we have now got in this city to support bringing great events to Christchurch, to compete with other centres around New Zealand, and we see the economic flow that we get when we have major events in the city is so vitally needed. So let's maximise the opportunity now that we've got some great facilities here, and to do that, let's not undercut the expenditure and the investment in Christchurch NZ's event portfolio, because it looks like you're reducing it rather than actually adding to. And at a time when we're starting to bring that infrastructure online, why would we reduce that versus actually adding to it? So that was a reference to the to Christchurch NZ. And in response to the issue around understanding the business environment, that's, I mean, you've heard me say that before, and I'll continue to say it. That's my role. We represent the business community, but this is not about representing the business community at the expense of everyone else. The business community provides the livelihoods for the residents of Christchurch. So the two go hand in hand. We can't have great community outcomes unless we've got a really strong business community and good economic growth and development. And so the two go hand in hand.
Thank you. James?
Thanks, Leeann, and thanks to the Chamber for the really
Well, you're very
constructive
quiet. I know.
What?
You're right.
You've talked about the vacant sites, but I'm just interested in the derelict sites, and I guess which of the two you think is more of a hindrance to the regeneration of the city. And I guess to frame it another way, would you see any merit in an additional rate or fine applying to owners of derelict sites who have no intention of tidying up their site, let alone developing it?
Yeah, it's a really good point, James. And I think one of the things that we talked about when Hamish and I were discussing this the other day was because we do have, you're quite right, there are derelict sites around the city, but that's different again to, those sites that are waiting to build on. And so this is what I mean by narrowing the scope and actually, looking at how we treat those different parts of the city in different ways. And, we would very much support having some criteria. And that's why I mentioned it's probably a bit of tongue in cheek, but I mentioned a lot of the car park sites around the city that are full of potholes and quite frankly a health and safety hazard when you're walking across to get your coffee or leaving at the end of the night when it's now dark. So having some standards to make sure that those sites are have a minimum requirement to at least be weeded and well lit or whatever it might be, we'd be very, very supportive of that because that's in no one's best interest in the city to actually have those sorts of derelict sites. So. But that's a different discussion, I guess. It's about how we narrow that scope and treat those sites differently.
Thank you very much, and you'll be pleased to know, and you would have noticed that some of those sites are actually being tidied up with new frontages and proper sort of footing underground. So and that has been our staff working directly with the owners of the properties.
Great.
So thank you very much for your submission.
Thank you, everyone.
The